She was 41 years old when the bank took the last thing she owned in the world, and she stood on the platform at Cold Spring Depot, watching two men in dark coats nail a notice to the door of her late husband's hardware shop, with a hammer that seemed too loud for such a small, final act. It was Otis Granger, president of the Cold Spring Trust, who had ordered it done, and he did it not because the debt was so large, but because the land beneath that shop sat square in the path of a spur line. He meant to sell to the railroad for more money than she would see in 10 lifetimes of mending kettles. What she had left after the bank finished with her was $11 folded in a handkerchief, a trunk of her husband's tools, and a stubbornness she had not yet learned to call a virtue. So when the auctioneer at the rail yard offered up a rusted, forgotten freight car sitting dead on a spur behind the depot, its wheels seized, its paint long since surrendered to weather, unwanted by every buyer in the yard, she paid $4 for it. And the men laughed, certain she had bought herself a coffin of iron and splinters. They did not know that sealed behind its inner wall was a secret that had waited 18 years to be found, one that would not only save her, but would call into question everything the town believed about the man who had just taken everything she had. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Della Mercer. If you have ever stood somewhere you loved and watched someone else decide its fate without asking you, tell us in the comments. We read everyone. Della Mercer had been born Della Whitfield in 1869 in a sod house outside Cold Spring, Nebraska, in a winter so hard that her mother always said she had come into the world already knowing how to endure one. Her father, Amos Whitfield, was a blacksmith, and from the time she was old enough to hold a bucket without spilling it, she had spent her afternoons in his forge, watching him coax shape out of stubborn iron with nothing but heat, patience, and the right angle of a hammer. He used to tell her that the secret to good work wasn't strength, though folks liked to believe that. It was listening, to the metal, to when it was ready to bend and when it would only crack if you forced it. Most men around Cold Spring did not think a girl belonged at a forge, and a few said so to Amos directly, but he only shrugged and said his daughter had better hands for fine work than half the boys who'd apprenticed under him, and that ended most conversations on the subject. Della grew up knowing the weight of tools, the smell of coal smoke, the particular music of metal struck true. She learned to read structures the way other girls learned to read books, the way a hinge should sit, the way a wheel should true, the way a thing built honestly announced itself and how it held together under strain. When she was 19, she married Thomas Mercer, a quiet, careful man who ran the hardware shop on Main Street and who courted her not with flowers but by asking her opinion on inventory, on which tools held their edge, on what farmers actually needed versus what catalogs claimed they needed. It was, for Della, the most romantic question anyone had ever asked her. Thomas was elder enough to have already buried one wife and young enough to still believe in starting over. And together they built the hardware shop into something the town depended on, not just for nails and plowshares, but for Thomas's quiet generosity. Credit extended to families who couldn't pay until harvest. Tools loaned out and not always tracked. A kindness that Della sometimes worried would be the end of them, and that, in the end, very nearly was. They had no children of their own, though Della often said the whole town's children passed through that shop at one point or another, sent by their mothers for a paper of tacks or a length of rope, and she came to know Cold Spring's families by their hands and their habits more than their names. Thomas taught her the books, the ordering, the long, slow arithmetic of running a small business in a town that was itself only ever one bad season from trouble. When influenza took him in the winter of 1908, Della was 39 years old, and she did not allow herself the luxury of falling apart, because the shop's debts did not pause for grief, and because she had learned from her father that endurance was not a feeling but a practice, something you did with your hands even when your heart had gone quiet. What she did not know, what almost no one in Cold Spring knew, was that 2 years before his death, Thomas had quietly co-signed a loan for a neighboring rancher named Earl Tibbets. A kindness extended the way all of Thomas's kindnesses were extended, without much accounting for what it might cost later. When Tibbets lost his cattle to Blackleg and defaulted, the debt rolled, silent and patient, onto the shop's ledgers, and Otis Granger, who held the note, watched the numbers with the particular attention of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Granger had wanted the land under Mercer's hardware for 3 years by then. Ever since the surveyors for the Union Pacific Spur had come through and marked the lot quietly as the most efficient route for a new feeder line that would connect Cold Spring to the larger trunk at Ogallala. He had said nothing to Della, He had simply waited, the way a man waits when he already knows how a hand of cards is going to fall, and when Thomas died and the debt came due in full, a clause Della had not known existed. Buried in fine print, Thomas himself may not have fully understood, Granger called the note. Della tried everything. She offered to sell inventory, to take on piecework mending tools, to negotiate a slower repayment, but Granger's mind, it became clear, had been made up long before her husband's funeral, and the bank foreclosed within 4 months of Thomas's death. The day they posted the notice, Della stood on the boardwalk across the street with Mrs. Agatha Hollis, who ran the boarding house, and who put a steadying hand on Della's arm as the hammer rang out against the door. "There's no shame in this, Della," Agatha said, and Della believed she meant it, but shame was not, in fact, the feeling rising in her chest. It was a colder thing, the specific fury of watching a man take something built by patience and call it merely business. She had $11, the clothes she stood in, her husband's trunk of tools, which the bank had let her keep only because no one thought to itemize them, and absolutely nowhere to sleep that did not depend on someone else's charity. It was Agatha who told her about the rail yard auction, almost as an afterthought, mentioning that the Union Pacific was clearing out a stretch of old rolling stock behind the depot to make room for the very spur line Granger had engineered, and that the auctioneer, a broad, sun-cracked man named Cyrus Bell, was practically giving cars away because nobody wanted the trouble of hauling off iron nobody could use. "Folks are buying them for scrap mostly," Agatha said, "though why anyone would want to live in one of those old hulks I couldn't say." She said it as a joke. Della did not laugh because she had already begun, in the back of her mind, to do arithmetic of a different kind. Shelter required 4 walls and a roof, and a freight car, whatever else it was, possessed both. The yard behind the depot was a graveyard of rolling stock, boxcars with their doors hanging like broken jaws, flat cars stripped down to skeleton frames, a derailed water tank lying on its side like a beached whale. Most of the bidding that morning went to scrap dealers from Ogallala, men who looked at the cars purely as tonnage of iron to be melted down and sold by the pound. But there was one car at the far end of the spur that nobody seemed to want even for that. It was an old boxcar, built sometime in the 1880s by the look of its ironwork, with a peculiar double-walled construction that Cyrus Bell mentioned almost apologetically, as though warning off potential buyers. "This one's a strange build," he said. "Heavier than she should be for her size. Scrap men don't like cars that don't weigh out the way they're supposed to. Costs more to break down than she's worth." Nobody bid. Della raised her hand and offered $4, mostly because $4 was an amount she could survive losing, and Cyrus Bell, surprised, brought the gavel down before anyone could think better of letting a widow have it. The men nearby laughed, not unkindly, but with the particular condescension reserved for someone who has clearly misunderstood the rules of a game everyone else is playing. "You bought yourself an icebox, Mrs. Mercer," one of them said, "without the ice." Della did not answer.
She had her father's old habit of letting work speak instead of words,
And so she simply asked Cyrus Bell where the keys to the rail yard tools might be, because she intended to see what she had actually purchased. The inside of the car smelled of cold iron and old straw, and the first thing Della noticed, running her hand along the wall the way her father had taught her to run a hand along any structure to feel for its truth, was that the interior wall did not sit flush against the exterior shell. There was a gap, too wide to be accidental, too consistent to be warping, and a seam along the floor that did not match the seams elsewhere. Cyrus Bell had been right. The car was heavier than it should be. Something had been built inside the building. A wall within the wall, and whoever had done it had done careful, deliberate, skilled work. The kind of work Della recognized instinctively because it was the same instinct her father had given her at the forge. This was not damage. This was design. She did not tell anyone that first night. In part because she had nowhere else to be in the car. Drafty as it was gave her a place to lay her head, and in part because some old, careful part of her, the part trained by years of watching her father read iron before he touched it, told her to look further before she spoke at all. By lamplight, with one of Thomas's old chisels from the trunk, she worked at the seam along the floor where the boards met unevenly, and after nearly an hour of careful, patient prying, a section lifted away to reveal a shallow cavity built between the floor and the car's true undercarriage. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas that had kept off nearly 2 decades of damp, she found a tin dispatch box, the kind railroad clerks used for important papers, and inside that, a thick ledger, several folded letters, and a velvet pouch heavier than its size suggested it ought to be. She did not open the pouch that first night. She read instead by the low light of her lamp, and what she read began to rearrange everything she thought she understood about Cold Spring's history. The ledger belonged to a man named Caleb Wren, a paymaster for the Union Pacific's Western Division in the early 1890s, and the letters, in a careful, anxious hand, told a story that the town of Cold Spring had never been told at all. In 1891, during the building of an earlier rail spur through the region, a payroll shipment intended for 300 laborers had gone missing en route, and the railroad, embarrassed and unwilling to absorb the loss publicly, had quietly blamed the disappearance on a foreman named Otis Granger's own father, Hiram Granger, who had been the dispatcher overseeing that very car. Hiram Granger had been dismissed in disgrace, his name quietly ruined among the railmen of the territory, and he had died 3 years later, still protesting his innocence to anyone who would listen, which by then was almost no one. But the ledger told a different story. Caleb Wren's careful entries, cross-referenced with the letters, made clear that the missing payroll had never actually been stolen at all. It had been deliberately hidden by Wren himself, who had intended to retrieve it later and abscond with it, but who had been transferred suddenly to a posting in Wyoming before he could return, and who, judging by the unfinished, almost frantic tone of his final letter, had grown afraid that pursuing the matter further would expose his own scheme. He had hidden the payroll gold and the explanatory ledger inside the false wall of this very car, the car he'd had specially built under contract, the strange build Cyrus Bell had warned of, intending it as a temporary cache, and then it seemed simply lost track of which car it was, or lost his nerve, or both, as the spur line was decommissioned and the car shuffled into the depot's forgotten siding for the next 18 years. Hiram Granger, dead and disgraced, had been entirely innocent. The man who had built his ruin into a small fortune for his son Otis, who had used the scandal and the family's resulting desperation as the foundation of the very banking empire that now ran Cold Spring, had been Caleb Wren, a thief who had simply walked away from the evidence of his own crime and let an innocent man's name absorb the blame. Della sat with this for a long while, the lamp burning low, the velvet pouch still unopened in her lap, and she understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that she was holding not just a fortune, but a reckoning. Otis Granger, the man who had taken her home and her husband's shop with the cold efficiency of a man simply doing business, had built every advantage of his life on the wreckage of a lie that had ruined his own father's name and, indirectly, the standing of his family for a generation, until, ironically, Otis had clawed his way back into respectability through banking, the same institution whose money had been stolen out from under his father in the first place. She did finally open the pouch, and inside found gold coin amounting to a sum that, by careful counting under lamplight, came to just over $4,000. Not a vast fortune by the standards of railroad barons, but an overwhelming sum for a widow with $11 to her name, and more than enough, she realized with a slow, dawning understanding, to settle every debt the bank claimed against her. With money left besides, she did not act rashly. She had learned patience from a forge fire that could ruin good iron if rushed, and she spent the following days quietly, working by day at mending tools for anyone who would pay her a little, and by night cross-referencing the ledger against what records she could find at the county courthouse, confirming dates, names, the original dismissal papers for Hiram Granger, building a case as carefully as her father had once built a hinge, strong at every joint, true under any strain anyone might put against it. When she finally went to Otis Granger's office at the bank, she did not go to beg, and she did not go to gloat. She went with the ledger, the letters, and a single gold coin laid deliberately on his desk, and she watched the color drain from his face as he recognized his own father's name in Caleb Wren's careful, damning handwriting. Granger was not, it turned out, an evil man so much as a frightened one who had spent 30 years building a fortress of respectability around a wound he'd never been allowed to properly grieve. And when he understood what Della held, proof that could either restore his father's name publicly or just as easily expose the entire ugly history to a town that had built its own narratives around the old scandal, something in him seemed to fold inward, smaller than the man who had foreclosed on her 4 months earlier. Della did not threaten him, not directly, but she made clear that she intended to bring the truth to the town regardless of what he chose to do, because Hiram Granger deserved, even in death, to have his name returned to him. What she offered Otis was something else, a choice in how the truth arrived. He could help her make it right, publicly and generously, or he could watch it unfold as exposure alone. To his credit, and perhaps to the surprise of everyone who thought they knew him, Otis Granger chose the harder, better path. He returned Della's shop and the land beneath it, voided the debt entirely, and stood beside her at a town meeting in the Cold Spring Grange Hall, where she read Caleb Wren's letters aloud and restored, 18 years late, his father's good name before the only people whose opinion had ever mattered to Hiram Granger at all. She did not keep the gold for herself, not most of it. She used a portion to rebuild the hardware shop and reopen its doors. True to Thomas's memory of extending credit to families who needed it, but she used the larger portion, at Otis Granger's quiet, almost grateful insistence, to establish a fund administered jointly by the bank and the town council for families facing exactly the kind of sudden, unjust ruin that had nearly taken everything from her. They named it, after some debate, the Wren Granger Fund, a name that held both the theft and the restoration in uneasy, honest balance, the way history so rarely allows villains and victims to be cleanly separated. The old freight car itself, the one nobody had wanted, the one bought for $4 amid laughter on a cold morning at the rail yard, was hauled by volunteers to a spot beside the rebuilt shop where Della had it restored, its false wall left intentionally visible behind a pane of glass, a small plaque explaining what had been found there and why. It became, in time, something the town pointed out to visitors, not a monument to gold, but to the strange, quiet justice of overlooked things, of how the very car that had ruined one Granger's name had, 18 years later, redeemed it. When people in Cold Spring tell this story now, they do not start with the gold. They start with Della Mercer, 41 years old, standing outside a hardware shop that had just been taken from her, with $11 folded in a handkerchief and nowhere left to sleep, choosing to spend $4 of those dollars on a car nobody else wanted because she had learned, long ago at her father's forge, that the worth of a thing is rarely visible from the outside, and that you do not know what you are holding until you are patient enough and brave enough to listen to it properly. She did not set out to expose a thief or restore a dead man's reputation, or build a fund that would, in the years that followed, keep a dozen other families from losing what she had nearly lost. She set out simply to survive the winter. Everything else, she would say later, was the iron telling her what it wanted to become, if only she was willing to listen. Thank you for spending this time with Della's story and with us. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need a reminder that what looks worthless to everyone else is not always worthless, and that patience has its own kind of arithmetic. Before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one, and your stories are often the reason we keep telling these. Until next time, stay close.